Oh, and kids can be dismissed.
We have this running game about who's going to say that at the close of the worship session. So I'm the backup, but they usually get it taken care of. So thank you guys. I love the worship. A few years ago, I shared what has come to be my favorite Christmas story apart from the original Christmas story. And today I'm going to share that story again, although I do try not to repeat stories very often. So those of you who've heard this story, I apologize in advance, but it's a very powerful story, and it's an example of things that God does in unexpected ways. Several years ago, actually many years ago, on Christmas Eve in 1914, the nations of Europe were embedded in what would be the first full year of World War I. They had gone to war that summer in the confident belief that things would be settled by Christmas time, but within a few months, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians had died. The Germans were advancing into France and were stopped at a river in September. And by October, battle lines had been established in an area called Flanders on the northern side of France and the southern edge of Belgium. Trenches were dug for both sides, and heavy rain began in that fall. The rain turned the trenches and the area between the trenches into a cold, muddy swamp, and the misery was unprecedented for the men who were stuck fighting in those trenches. Their only consolation was that their enemy, who were only 50 yards away, were also stuck in muddy trenches. In early December, there was an attempt made by the Pope at the time to secure a truce for the holidays, and he had written to all of the country's leaders that were involved in the conflict and asked that the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. The Pope's hope was that a truce would be established during the holidays and fighting would not need to resume. But to his dismay, none of the leaders of the countries who were involved in the conflict were interested in establishing any kind of a truce. So that fall, as fall turned into December, the battlefields of Flanders was blanketed with snow. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of the nation that we now refer to as Germany, sent decorated Christmas trees to his troops so that they could light candles and set them up in their trenches in order to boost morale. And on Christmas Eve, as the sun set, the guns on both sides fell silent, and the Germans began to light the candles and stick the Christmas trees up on the upper edge of the trenches so that everyone could see them. And then in one trench, a soldier on the German side began to loudly sing. Good morning, my name is Kevin Clark, and I'm the senior pastor here, and Christmas is upon us. I hope you know that's happening. It's very close. For many of us, that brings us joy. For some of us, that brings some severe anxiety. We are here to celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ and all the things that come along with that particular season. But for some, Christmas produces tension. Another year has passed by, and either nothing has changed or perhaps everything has changed for you. And sometimes we look back at this time of the year at the things that have happened all throughout that year, and we ask ourselves questions like, where was God this year? Why didn't he answer my prayers? Why didn't he relieve my pain? Why didn't he fulfill my plans? Why didn't he increase my power? Questions like that run through all of our heads from one time to another. But because of the nature of our calendar, they surface more frequently in the holiday season. And if you feel that way, you are in good company. I've told you in every message in this series that the Jews of the first century faced many challenges. Most of them were farmers. The work was incredibly hard. They did it by hand. The pay was low. Taxes were high. Food was sparse. Life was short. Rome ruled all of Israel, and they ruled harshly, and even the rebellions that did pop up were squashed very quickly. Pain was an everyday part of life, and for the Jews, God felt strangely absent because no prophet had spoken to the Jews for approximately 400 years. And so every year, the Jews would find themselves asking questions like, where was God this year? So if you have a Bible or a Bible app, today we will be in Matthew chapter 2. And today we're going to look at the story of a group of men who were searching for power. One of them wanted power to maintain his grip on what he already had. The others were looking for a way to give away what they had to a worthy power. As Christmas comes near, what are you looking for with respect to power? Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says this. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Now, sometime after Jesus was born, Matthew tells us a group of wise men, or magi, as the Greek text actually refers to them, came from the east, and they were looking for the new Jewish king. They had seen a star. They had recognized it as a sign of that new Jewish king's arrival, and later we'll learn they didn't just see the star, they followed it as it led them toward Israel. But first, let's ask the question, who were these men? Most of us know the Christmas song that starts, we three kings of Orient are. Fortunately, I will not sing anymore. Unfortunately, that's not a very accurate song. Matthew later tells us that the men of the East brought 3 gifts, but he doesn't tell us how many there were in terms of men, and he doesn't tell us they were kings. That was actually a tradition that developed in Christianity later. Scripture really tells us very little about these men, but what do we know? The word magi comes from ancient Persian, which is the language of was the language of what is now Iran. The Persian word was magush, and when translated into Greek, it became magos, and then in Latin, it was magus, which is the word that we get our English word magic from. But Persian magi were not magicians, nor were they kings. Instead, they were a high-ranking class of pagan priests who studied religions, not just their own religion, but all world religions to which they had access, and their alleged connections to the movements of stars and the sun and the moon. So they were advisors to kings, but they were not royalty themselves. They were, however, unusually for their time, monotheistic, meaning they believed in only one God, not the God of the Bible, but one God. And so some Bible scholars believe that the wise men actually came from Persia based on the word Matthew chose. But other Bible scholars think the wise men came from Babylon. The book of Daniel refers to wise men. He sometimes calls them magicians or enchanters in the Babylonian courts. Hundreds of years before Jesus was born, when the Jews were held in captivity in the Babylonian Babylonian Empire. Those men must have heard the prophecies of the Jews because so many Jews lived among them, including Daniel, who was highly influential from the court on down. And it is likely that those wise men may have handed down what they knew of those prophecies to future generations that they trained to take their places. But Matthew does not confirm the exact nature, or rather the exact location from which these wise men came. Nor does Matthew tell us very much about the nature of the object they saw in the sky. He says they called it a star. Did God use an actual star, or did he use something else? Sometimes people, hearing that the star moved, assume it must have been a comet, because comets do move, but they move in predictable ways, and we have no reliable accounts of comets, unknown or known, that would have passed through the sky at the right time surrounding the season of Jesus' birth. So perhaps God could have used a conjunction or an alignment of stars and planets. In 7 BC, Babylonian astronomers reported alignment of what we now call Jupiter. They referred to it as the star of the king. Saturn, which they said was the star that represented the Jews, and the constellation we now call Pisces, which they said represented the nation of Israel. Those three stellar objects came into conjunction with one another around 7 BC, which can tell you why they might have thought this is a sign of a new king arising among the Jews in the nation of Israel. But it does raise questions that Matthew refers or says that they called it a star when men of their background would have known it was multiple stellar objects coming together. Could God have used a supernova? In 5 BC, near the date when many Bible scholars think that Jesus was born, Chinese astronomers reported a visible supernova that could be seen in broad daylight that lasted for months. And some scholars suggest that was the star that the wise men might have followed. Could it have been any of those things or a combination of those things? It is possible. A few scholars actually note that the word star is sometimes used in the Old Testament and was used later in Revelation to refer to angels. And so some scholars, they're in a minority, would say that perhaps the star they followed was actually an angel who led them to the scene of Jesus. We'd like to know a little bit more precisely, but Scripture doesn't give us more. Apparently, God did not think we needed to know more. We know the Magi saw what they called a star. We know that verse 9, which we'll read in a moment, says it moved and it stopped over the place where Jesus was. And we know that these wise men recognized it as a sign of the birth of a new Jewish king. The question is, why would foreigners from an almost 1,000-mile journey away be interested in the sign of a Jewish king? One modern Bible scholar, his name is Michael Wilkins, wrote this. And this belief had, I didn't. Oh, there we go, sorry. An expectation had circulated in the world of the first century that a ruler would arise from Judea. Israel's prophets had long spoken of a period of peace and prosperity that would be instituted by a future deliverer from the line of David. This belief had penetrated beyond the borders of Israel so that others were looking for a ruler to arise from Judea. It wasn't just the Jews who were expecting a Jewish Messiah by the first century. There is indication in writings from cultures all over the Middle East and the Roman Empire that this was widespread knowledge. This was an expectation that went far beyond the Jews. One Roman historian named Suetonius wrote this: "Throughout the whole of the East there had spread an old and persistent belief. Destiny had decreed that at that time a man coming forth from Judea would seize power and rule the world. By the first century, millions of Jews were expecting the imminent arrival of the Messiah. But millions of people outside of Israel and the Jewish faith also expected the imminent arrival of a Jewish Messiah. Why would Gentiles, non-Jews, wait with a sense of anticipation for the arrival of a Jewish Messiah? Centuries of poverty, oppression, war, disease, and death had shown them that they and their governments were powerless to change their circumstances. Even men of wealth and influence, like the Magi, could see kings squabbling over trinkets and territories while thousands suffered and died in endless cycles of despair. Almost every single person living in the first century would be hoping for a power that could change the world. What kind of power are you and I hoping for? Ask yourself these questions. What power have I prayed God would give me? And what would I do with it if he did? Now, you might say, I never pray for power. That sounds incredibly arrogant. Really? You've never asked God for the power to land a certain job, or to score a certain grade on an exam, or to date or marry a certain person, or to lose the weight, or to earn more money, or to influence an outcome, or to change a life, your own or someone else's? I would bet that everybody in this room has prayed for power using nicer words than that at least once in the past year. Did God give that power to you? And what did you do with it if he did? Or what would you have done with it if he chose to now? Every single person who lived in the first century knew that the world was a mess. They knew that the world needed someone with the power to change it. And like today, many probably prayed for power for themselves to change just their own lives, if nothing else. But there were some who thought bigger. There were some who looked and prayed for a Messiah to whom they could give their power, a person who would make the world right again. When the wise men came to Jerusalem from far away to find a king to whom they could give power, their arrival created a citywide uproar. Look at Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, that the wise men were looking for the new king, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. When the wise men arrived and they asked Herod about the new king of the Jews, this current king, Herod, was troubled. Why? because he was the current king. He was the ruler over Israel and all of its surroundings. And he had been appointed to that position, that throne, by Caesar. And he was using his appointment and his backing by the Roman Empire to fill his pockets and to glorify himself by building major project after major project at the cost of the lives of many people. Herod was Jewish, but only half Jewish, and he was a cruel tyrant. So the Jews, who were supposed to recognize him as king, did so while secretly despising him. He taxed his citizens into utter poverty, and he demanded total submission from them. And since they hated him, Herod was terrified of a Jewish rebellion that would roust him out of his position and perhaps take his life. So to stay in power, Herod executed anyone and everyone who posed a threat in his mind to his power. He was responsible personally for ordering the deaths of thousands of citizens in what we now call Israel. He also got more personal than that. He had 2 of his own brothers-in-law executed. He had one of his wives and her mother executed. And he had 2 of his own sons executed. And it was so risky to be part of Herod's family that Caesar Augustus famously said, "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son." When the wise men asked Herod, "Where is the new king of the Jews?" Herod was troubled, and the citizens knew when Herod is troubled, we're all troubled. So they were troubled too. But Herod was not a stupid man. He was cruel and he was paranoid, but he was also very clever. And he wanted to find this new king and kill him before he gained a following. So he called those who knew where the Messiah was to be born, the Jewish leaders. And those leaders quoted a biblical prophecy to him. It was written 700 years before the birth of Jesus. God told a prophet Micah the exact location of the Messiah's birth. It would be in Bethlehem, a tiny town about 5 miles from the walls of Jerusalem. What did Herod do when he learned the location? Look at verses 7 and 8. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word too, that I may come and worship him." So after the Jewish leaders told Herod that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, he called the wise men back secretly. He confirmed exactly when the star appeared, which would tell him the time of this new king's birth. And that information would tell him how old the baby would be. And then Herod said, "Go find the child, come back and tell me, and then I will go and worship him too." Now, we know that Herod was lying. We have read this story or heard this story many times. We know he had no intention of worshiping Jesus at all. He intended to kill him. So why waste time on secret meetings and lies? Because it was politically expedient. Herod was so fearful of rebellion, and he had a heightened awareness of people's expectation of the imminent arrival of the Messiah, that he feared if he killed the Messiah, once the Messiah was known to have arrived, that a rebellion would swamp his nation and his life would be in jeopardy as well. So he called the wise men secretly and sent them to Bethlehem alone, because sending soldiers with them would expose his plan. Above all else, Herod desired one thing. He desired power. Herod wanted power to continue acquiring great wealth. He wanted power to hang on to all of the things that he had acquired. He wanted the power to determine his destiny, the direction of his life. And he wanted the power to expect, even demand, obedience and respect from those who ought to obey and respect him. have you and I ever desired any of those kinds of power? Who hasn't from time to time? It is our nature to ask for the power to be masters of our own lives. That is what Herod wanted above everything else, to be master of his own life. Now, you and I might think, well, I would never be like Herod. I would never ask for any of those kinds of power. But the question is, what kinds of power do we think is actually okay to ask God for? Is it okay to ask God for power to make more money? Is it okay to ask God for power to protect the things that we have already acquired? Is it okay to ask God for the power of self-determination? Is it okay to ask God for the respect of our peers and the obedience of those under us? As this year ends, sometimes you and I wonder, why didn't God increase my power? What response do we find to those kinds of requests in this story about the birth of Jesus? Look at verses 9 through 12. After listening to the king, the wise men went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their country by another way. So the wise men left Herod. They followed the star to Bethlehem. The star they followed for nearly 1,000 miles, measured by the roads that existed back in the first century. And the star came to rest, according to Scripture, over the place where Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were. Scripture says that the wise men saw the star there, and they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They actually celebrated when they realized their journey was at an end and they had arrived where the new king was. What exactly were they celebrating? These men of great power had come to find a king of greater power, but they met a child who was small and fragile and in need of protection. His parents were poor, they were unknowns, and they were in need of resources and guidance. By comparison to other kings, this king was weak. The world was hoping for a Messiah who would lead armies, who would defeat enemies, who would exert power on behalf of his people. Instead, this king would one day allow his enemies to crucify him. He would not act in power, but in weakness. You and I think if we were honest, would have to admit that occasionally, like Herod, we desire power. Power to achieve the outcomes we think are best for our lives. But more often than not, God's power is demonstrated, or we could use the word magnified, but not by him making us more powerful, but by him working on our behalf in spite of our powerlessness and weakness. What looks weak to us and in us is what shows us and the rest of the world God's power to save us. The Apostle Paul had a great weakness. He described it as a thorn in his flesh. He even called it a messenger of Satan. He said it was given to him to keep him from being conceited because Jesus had revealed so much truth to him that had not been revealed to others. Paul never says what that thorn was, but he tells us that he asked God, he pleaded with God to remove it so he could be strong, not weak. In other words, that he might have more power. Now, his intentions were good. He wanted to do more from God. What did God say when he asked? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 and 9, it says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it, the thorn, should leave me. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Paul asked God to make him strong, to remove the thing that was causing him weakness, to increase his power. And in response, what God said led Paul to discover the same kind of thing the wise men discovered, that what to us may look weak makes us better able to see and experience the true magnitude of God's power. God's power is magnified in weakness. Now, why did the wise men go to Jerusalem first? They obviously thought that was the best place to go, and probably because they expected the new king to already live in the halls of power, surrounded by wealth and influence. And I suspect they may have thought that he was one of the sons of Herod, unless they had specific information that told them he was not. And they hoped to build connections with this new Messiah king, perhaps by interacting with his family in the palace. Instead, they were redirected, and they found an ordinary child in an ordinary house with ordinary parents, living in ordinary weakness. Yet coming face to face with this child, Jesus Christ, they realize that God's power is most magnified in that which appears to us to be powerless. If that's true, then like Paul, rather than ask for more power so that we can do what we want to do, we should celebrate, as Paul did, in our inability to do some of the things we would like to do. Only then can we fully realize that anything we accomplish was done not by us, but was done by God. When the wise men entered the house and they saw Jesus, it said they fell down and they worshiped him. In addition to the fact that it is unlikely the wise men arrived on the night of Jesus' birth, most nativity scenes get the posture of the wise men wrong. They're usually shown standing or kneeling like they are in the picture on the screen. But the Greek word that's used here says they fell flat on their faces, foreheads to the ground. It means being leveled. These men, wealthy, influential, prominent, powerful in their own right, fell flat on their faces in worship of a toddler. Do you ever wonder how they might have felt in that moment? They knew a Messiah king was promised. That's why they'd come. Did they know he was the Son of God? Probably not. His own disciples didn't really realize who he was until they had spent every day with him for quite some time. But the wise men knew they were in the presence of a king that was so great that a star had shown and led them to the place where he was, that they might find him. He was a king mightier than Herod, mightier than Caesar, mightier than the king of their own empire, a king with power to save the world. And since he was, the only appropriate response was to worship him. God's power is magnified in worship. These men fell on their faces, and what power they had themselves before they left home became as nothing to them in that moment. No more pride, no more ambition can remain in our hearts when we come face to face with who Jesus really is, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He does not offer us power to build our own personal kingdoms. He offers us a place to serve in his. And the only appropriate response to him is, and his offer of worship, is his offer of a place in his kingdom, is for us to worship him with wholehearted obedience. Only then can we truly experience his power as it was meant to be known. After they had worshiped Jesus, the wise men, it says, gave 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. As we study scripture, scholars have kind of pieced together the significance of those gifts. Gold is typically associated with divinity. Frankincense was something that was offered as a sacrifice. And so it is associated with Jesus because he is to be, or was to be, our sacrifice. Myrrh was a burial spice and was associated with suffering. And so much has been written about the significance of those 3 gifts. But I think when we focus on that, we miss what is actually happening here. Verse 12 says, "And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way." That verse almost sounds like a footnote to the list of the gifts. And yet embedded in that verse is confirmation of a change of heart that happened to those men. They were willing to do, at this point, having met Jesus, whatever God told them to do. Apparently, they spent at least one night because they had a dream, or they all had dreams. And in the dream, God said, "Don't go back to Herod." And so when they awoke, they chose to do what God had said to do with willingness. God's power is magnified in willingness. And we may ask, willingness to do what? Well, it's whatever God asks us to do. When we ask God for power, we usually ask him for the power to do something that we want to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asking. We seldom are asking for power and simultaneously asking him what he wants us to do. When the wise men began their journey, they were probably looking for a king who would do things they hoped a Messiah or super king would do. And they probably had their own agendas in their hearts, things they thought they might ask for if they had managed to establish the right kind of relationship with this king and perhaps his family. If they had wanted to stay in the good graces of a royal family so that they could use those connections for power and greater influence and to set themselves up for the lives that they perhaps wanted to live, they should have gone back to Herod. He, after all, was the true, in human eyes, symbol of real power. And yet something had happened when they had encountered this child that changed their hearts. And as they gave their gifts, they gave away some of their power and influence to him, trusting that he would use what they gave to do what he had come to do. At the end of the year, some of us are asking, why hasn't God made me a little bit more powerful in the areas that I think I should be a little bit more powerful in? Maybe you're stuck in a job and you are powerless to find another one. You have tried and there just isn't one out there. Maybe you're stuck in a marriage that has begun to collapse and you feel powerless. You have tried to save it and it does not seem to be working. Maybe you're trapped in an addiction and no matter how much willpower you have exerted, you are powerless to beat it. Maybe you've been a victim of something terrible at some point in the past. And no matter how much you try to put that thing out of your mind and behind you, it keeps coloring every moment of every day of your life. And you keep asking God over and over again, please give me the power to move past that into the next season of life. But God has not answered. Perhaps he's saying to us, my power is magnified in weakness, in worship, and in willingness to do what I have called you to do. On Christmas Eve, 1914, as Allied and German troops who were stuck for months along the French and Belgian border faced each other across trenches that were 6 to 8 feet deep, that were filled with water, that were cold and nasty, many men were in despair. As darkness fell, the shooting that went on almost all day long tapered off, and German troops began to light the candles on their small Christmas trees and set the trees on the edge of the trenches where the Allied troops could see them too. Then, from one trench, a German soldier began to sing. He sang Silent Night. And he sang it in German, but just like every person in this room, every Allied soldier recognized the tune and quickly began to sing along with the Germans. Spontaneous applause broke out after the song. And someone on the Allied side started another Christmas carol. For hours, the back and forth singing went on and on. And finally, a few brave men climbed out of the trenches and walked across the no man's land from both sides and offered a truce just for Christmas Eve. The spontaneous ceasefire spread up and down hundreds of miles of battle lines. Soldiers left their trenches, they met in the middle, they shook hands with the enemy. The first order of business was to gently and respectfully gather up the bodies of their comrades and transport them behind the lines where they could be taken home. But once that was done, soldiers on both sides laid down their rifles and began to give gifts to each other. Cake from home, wine, postcards, newspapers, tobacco. And a few soldiers even pulled out soccer balls, and they began to play games that spontaneously began with soldiers from both sides on each team. The truce lasted through not just Christmas Eve, but through Christmas Day and into the next day. And in several places, officers had to threaten court-martials to get the men to begin shooting at each other again. Alfred Anderson was the last British veteran of that 1914 Christmas truce. He died in 2005 at the age of 109. The last time he was interviewed, he was asked what it was like on the night of the spontaneous Christmas Eve truce. He said, "I remember the silence, the eerie sound of silence. All I'd heard for 2 months in the trenches was the hissing and cracking and whining of bullets in flight, machine gun fire, and distant German voices. But that night, there was a dead silence across the land as far as you could see and hear. And I remember the point where we all shouted, "Merry Christmas." It's certain that there were Christians on both sides, and that both sides were praying. And undoubtedly, many of these men were praying for the power not only to fight, but the power to survive. And on that Christmas Eve, I would bet many of them prayed for at least a small window of peace. Yet not one of those men by himself had the power to make that happen. So in their weakness, a few chose to worship with their voices. And when they did, the willingness to lay down their arms marked these men as men who knew the importance of Jesus' birth. Do we know the importance of Jesus' birth? Would you bow your heads with me?